me today, we celebrate Jewish festivals. Well, we actually do. They've been Christianized. We celebrate pagan festivals that have been Christianized. And so, he talked about Saint Jerome, who said, take them where they are. And so what a lot of these pagans took basically and appropriated the Christian faith to what they were celebrating already. And so the whole thing of resurrection and new life is, well, they already have festivals for new life, spring. And so it corresponds whenever they celebrate. They say, oh, this is the day to celebrate. So what they were celebrating before is now given new meaning. And so that's one of the things that's interesting about the Christian faith and the Jewish faith, is that it's actually been formed by other faiths. We get that, for example, the whole idea of the devil comes to us from another religion. That's appropriate. So over time, we've appropriated these things into our understanding of God and how we do things.
And the concept of the afterlife.
And the concept of the afterlife. And so, one of the things about Christianity and about God and all is that it has been evolving. It's not like all of a sudden the Bible, here it is, bam. Even the Bible itself evolved. That's why you have 4 different gospels. Each one is different. Mark, because they're understanding Paul, etc., has evolved. And that's something that a lot of people have. No, we didn't. It was always like this. God didn't come down and say, here's the Bible, here's the canon, and say, here you go.
All right, well, welcome to the 3rd installment of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England. Thanks for showing up tonight, by the way. So I'm going to, as always, begin with a review of the things that we covered, and most importantly, some of the things that you need to understand for what we're going to cover tonight. So remember that Britain was part of the Roman Empire. It was invaded in the 400s by these people from what is now Denmark and northern Germany, and even the Netherlands, the Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians, okay? And mostly the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. They invaded, they conquered the eastern part of the island, and then by the time we started our class, they had formed themselves into 7 different kingdoms. And as we're going to see tonight, there's more coalescing going on. We'll be down to 4 kingdoms when we start our story tonight. But the important story of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the other occupants of the island of Britain, the people we call the Britons, is constant warfare, right? The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are fighting each other. They shrink in number, and they're also fighting the Britons. So we saw that in 595, and I still need to fix that slide, 595 AD, that's when Pope Gregory sent his missionaries to the island of Britain. He had seen these blonde-haired, blue-eyed Anglo-Saxon slaves in the slave market there in Rome, and always had it in his head that he wanted to convert these people, which he did. And the conversion started in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Kent, and the capital of Kent was Canterbury, which is why to this day, the mother church in England of the Anglican church is Canterbury. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the head of that church. And as we were talking about at the beginning of the class, Gregory's strategy for converting the Anglo-Saxons was let them keep as much of their familiar pagan practices as you possibly can. If they've got a temple, clear out the idols, sprinkle it with holy water, stick a couple relics in there, and boom, it's a Christian church. If they've got a holiday where they worship a goddess named Estra in the 4th month, that's timed perfectly, right, with Easter. So let them continue to call it Easter, but now they're celebrating the feast of Christ's resurrection, right? Gregory was playing the long game. He who wishes to climb a mountain does so one step at a time and not in one single leap. And last week we talked about Christianity in the northern part of Britain, the northern English kingdom of Northumbria, and we saw that the conversion there happened a little bit differently, right? We had both Christianity coming in from the south, this Roman version of Christianity, and we had Christianity introduced from the north or from Ireland, this Celtic version of Christianity. And we had 2 different celebrations of Easter, which was causing confusion, and they got that all straightened out at the Synod of Whitby, where the Roman version of Christianity prevailed, okay? So now we get into the fun part of our class, right? The Viking Age. So the prologue to the Viking Age begins in the year 789 AD, all right? So over in Europe, Charlemagne is ruling on the continent. He's going to make an appearance here in a few minutes. But we are, almost 200 years removed from when Christianity first came to the Anglo-Saxons. It's firmly ensconced, okay? The Anglo-Saxons have embraced Christianity to the point that they have sent missionaries to Germany to convert the pagan Germans to Christianity. And in 789 AD, we have down in the southern kingdom of Wessex, we have this little spit of land called Portland, okay? Has a nice little port there, hence the name. And one of the king's officials, a guy named a reeve, that's the local administrator of the king's estates in that area, okay? And the larger units of a kingdom are called shires. We would call them counties, okay? And the shires had their own reeves, the shire reeves, and that's where we get the word sheriff from, okay? So the king's reeve is basically the king's official, and he gets word that 3 ships have landed on this little spit of land called Portland. So he assumes they are traders coming to sell their wares to the English or buy wares from the English. And he goes down as the king's official to make sure that these guys pay their tolls, pay their taxes, okay? And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes what happens when the reeve goes down and meets these 3 ships that have landed on Portland. In this year, this is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, okay? Written way back in the 800s. In this year, there came for the first time 3 ships of Northmen, and the reeve rode to them and wished to force them to the king's residence, for he did not know what they were, and they slew him. Those were the first ships of Danish men which came to the land of the English. So this is the beginning of the Viking Age, but it's fairly quiet for a few years until 793. And this is where we get the equivalent of 9/11 for not just the Anglo-Saxons, but really for all of Western Europe. We get the sack of Lindisfarne. Remember, we talked about Lindisfarne last week. That was that little island off the coast of Northumbria where the first Irish missionaries who came to convert the Anglo-Saxons, that's where they set up shop. And it became this renowned center of learning, okay, throughout Europe. And as we're going to see, by 793, it's famous even on the continent. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells it best what happened in 793. In this year, fierce, foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria. There were excessive whirlwinds, lightning storms, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. These signs were followed by great famine. And on June 8th, the ravaging of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. So God sent all these portents before inflicting upon the English the heathen men who destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. And this is a huge deal. As far away as Charlemagne's court, where, if you remember from my class on the Pope's forgery, Charlemagne had actually set up this reformation of his church and this intellectual kind of reform of his kingdom, where he wanted a standardized system of learning. And the guy that he hired to do this, the guy that he hired as his imperial schoolmaster, if you will, was a guy named Alcuin, who hailed from York, an Anglo-Saxon. Alcuin is familiar with Lindisfarne, and when he hears what's happened, here's what he writes. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the body of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. Some of the stories we have of what the Vikings did at Lindisfarne, they killed some of the monks, they brought some of them out, stripped them naked just to humiliate them. They got all the treasure that they could, because of course, everybody in this age is giving to the church, that these are the repositories of wealth and beautiful things. And the things that weren't of any value to them, like books, they destroyed. Okay. One thing that survived, we saw last week, was the Lindisfarne Gospels, that beautiful illuminated manuscript, because sometimes the monks would risk their lives during these attacks to save what they thought was most valuable. They would hide it, they would bury it, whatnot. So for whatever reason, we have the Lindisfarne Gospels, despite this event. And from this point forward, Europe is on notice that something new has emerged on the scene. We've got this invasion threat, these raiders who come out of nowhere and disappear into the darkness as quickly as they came. So why did the Vikings suddenly show up in 793 AD? Well, this is really just the latest chapter in an ongoing story of people erupting out of Scandinavia and causing problems in Europe. As far back as the 1st century BC, so the time of Julius Caesar and his compatriots, we have a couple of Germanic tribes erupting out of what is now Denmark, the Cimbri and the Teutones, who invade Europe, and the Romans are so afraid of what's going to happen that they make their greatest general essentially a dictator to go and deal with this military threat. Then 150-ish years later, a new group of people emerges out of Scandinavia, the Goths, right? And we talked a lot about the Goths in our Roman history class, the fall of Rome. The Goths eventually are going to sack the city of Rome, okay? And so in the 5th century, we have the 3rd wave coming out of Scandinavia, our good friends, the Angles, Jutes, and Saxons, the guys who end up conquering Britain. So now we get to the 8th century, the 700s, and what's been happening there is we've had a stretch of global warming, okay? We've had a stretch of warm weather for several decades, which has allowed the population to increase to the point that you've got all these extra sons who survive childhood because they're not starving to death, but now there's not enough farmland to support them, right? So what do? You go a Viking, you go off in your ship. The other key thing that happens at this particular moment, we can blame on Charlemagne, right? Remember, Charlemagne was very zealous about converting the pagan peoples around him. We saw what he did with the Saxons. You either convert or I'm going to kill you, basically. So on his northern fringe is this area called Frisia, right? Which at this time had been the most powerful naval power in the North Sea. So they had kind of kept the Vikings at bay, right? They were kind of a bulwark naval-wise against the Vikings. So Charlemagne decides that he's going to convert the Frisians, and like the Saxons, they're pretty stubborn. So when they don't convert, Charlemagne kills a bunch of them, okay? So he subjugates the Frisians to the point that they are no longer able to be this great military power. And as a result, the cork is taken out of the bottle and the Vikings are no longer pinned in, if you will, thanks to what Charlemagne did. The secret to the Viking success is the design of their longships. The Vikings are able to sail in very quickly, sail up rivers, hit a monastery, take what they want, and withdraw before the locals can react. And the design of their ships is what allows them to do this. If you look at this picture of a Viking ship, you can see that it's very, very wide with a very small keel. The keel doesn't stick down very much from the rest of the hull of the ship. So they can actually navigate in waters that are only 3 feet deep. These ships have a very shallow, what is called a draft. They don't go down into the water very far. That's why they can sail up rivers that today modern ships wouldn't be able to sail into, okay? And they're very easily beached. When the Vikings get to where they want to go, they hop out, they drag the boat up onto the sand, and they're off pillaging and raping. If they need to carry the boat from one body of water to another, the boats are light enough that the crew can put it up on their shoulders and portage it, carry it. They can be powered by both oars and by sails. You've got a picture here. You can see that the sail is up. So when the winds are right, the Vikings can hoist the sail and be carried along by the wind. But when it's not, they've got oars. They can do it either way. And they've got a great name for their boats. They called them wave stallions. Okay. The English are completely unprepared for this kind of warfare. Of course, they've been fighting amongst each other and with the British for hundreds of years. They are a warlike people, okay? But they are ill-equipped for the tactics that the Vikings are going to inflict on them. First of all, the English have no navy at all. Surprising, because they had come by boat, right, and attacked the island. And of course, we think of the British as having the preeminent navy in the world. But after they settled in Britain, they basically lost their seafaring ways. So they have no navy to counter the Vikings. What we've got is local landowners are local warriors. They're called thanes. and each thane is going to have his own little war band, okay? So theoretically, if the Vikings were to attack the local thane, it would be a different story, right? But they're not doing that. They're hitting vulnerable spots like monasteries, which they've learned, right, is where all the money is, okay? That's where all the gold and jewels and everything that people have been donating are in these monasteries that are not defended, okay? There are no warriors at these monasteries, it's just monks. So by the time the local thane finds out that this is happening, the Vikings are already gone, okay? The overall army of a given Anglo-Saxon kingdom is called the fyrd. That's like the militia. The local thane could call up the militia, the people that are not in his war band, right? The king could call it up, but again, way too slow. By the time you get the militia organized, right, it may be quick enough to fight off an army that's walking in from the neighboring Anglo-Saxon kingdom, but it's not fast enough to deal with the Vikings. They are hit and run. And as we've seen, the Anglo-Saxons themselves are not a unified enemy against the Vikings. They're not going to cooperate island-wide to fend off this new threat. They're more focused on fighting each other, okay? And by the time we start our story here in the 800s, the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms have been consolidated into 4. So we've got Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. Kent has been swallowed up by Wessex. The East Saxons have been swallowed up by East Anglia and Wessex, so we're losing kingdoms. But the important thing is that we cannot talk about anything called England yet. There's no such thing as England as a geographical or a political entity. You can talk about it as the land occupied by the Angles, but they viewed themselves as 4 separate kingdoms. So the first phase of the Viking Age is the rape and pillage phase. That's what everybody thinks of when they think of the Vikings, right? And so I've got a selection of entries from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to kind of give you a flavor of what it was like in Anglo-Saxon England. 795. The heathens ravaged in Northumbria and plundered Ecgfrith's monastery at Donamuthon. In 835, in this year, the heathen men ravaged Sheppey. In 836, King Egbert fought against the crews of 35 ships, and a great slaughter was made there, and the Danes had the possession of the field of slaughter. In 838, a great naval force arrived among the Welsh and combined with them and proceeded to fight King Egbert. So the Vikings are shrewdly exploiting the divisions in the island and allying themselves with the Welsh. In 841, Ealdorman Herbert was killed by the heathen men and many men with him in the marsh. In 842, there was a great slaughter in London, Canterbury, and Rochester. Year after year, place after place, people are dying. In 845, we start to see a glimmer of hope. Ealdorman Churl and the men of Devon fought the heathen at Wickenburg, and the English made a great slaughter and had the victory. They're starting to figure things out. But in 851, something very ominous happens. 350 ships came into the mouth of the Thames, and for the first time, the heathen men stayed through the winter on Thanet. So we're exiting the phase of rape and pillage with small bands of 35 ships. Now we're entering the new phase of conquest. And there's a great story behind the Viking conquest of England, tied to a guy named Ragnar Lothbrok. Okay. Probably not historically accurate, but it's a great story, so I'm giving it to you anyway. Okay. All right, so Ragnar Lothbrok, his nickname is Lothbrok, and it means shaggy breeches. Okay. And there's a story behind this. So apparently he has these breeches made out of lamb's wool that's like all gnarly and, you know, little clumps of yarn sticking out. So they're shaggy, okay? And he's somewhere in Norway and it's bitter, bitter cold and he's making his way through kind of a sleeting rain and his shaggy breeches get all wet and then they freeze. So they're like solid little clumps on his legs. And he encounters a nest of vipers, of snakes. And the snakes attack him. And because he's got these frozen pants on, the snakes can't bite through and kill him. So he kind of gets from this episode this aura of invincibility, okay? And like Ragnar Lothbrok becomes kind of the first super famous Viking of his age. According to legend, he's everywhere. He sacks Paris. He's in Britain. He's in Ireland, okay? So he comes back to Northumbria, and this is his final stop. He encounters an Anglo-Saxon official by the name of Aella. Aella is not a king, but he's some rank below king. Maybe he's the king's reeve. We don't know. But Ragnar is there raiding. Ella shows up with his force of men, and he captures the famous Ragnar Lothbrok. And everybody at this point knows Ragnar Lothbrok. And of course, you recognize him right off the bat because of his shaggy breech. And Aella knows the story about how the shaggy breeches saved Ragnar Lothbrok from the nest of vipers. And so what he does is he decides to execute Ragnar Lothbrok in a poetically dramatic fashion. He has his men dig a pit and fill it with poisonous snakes. And he throws Ragnar Lothbrok into the pit. And of course, he's bitten to death by these poisonous snakes and dies. But as he dies, he utters a prophecy, or perhaps a threat. And it is, if the piglets could only see the sow now, how they would squeal, or if the piglets could only see the boar, how they would squeal. Basically, he's saying, I hope my sons will avenge me. And that is exactly what happens. In the year 866, we get what is called the Great Heathen Army of Vikings that attacks Britain, intent on, according to legend, avenging Ragnar Lothbrok, okay? Now, of course, the Vikings have never needed a reason before to attack Britain, right? But now they've got this casus belli, as the Romans would call it. So they land in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of East Anglia. And the leaders of this great heathen army, this is what the Anglo-Saxons call it, the great heathen army. The leaders of this are the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Let's see, did somebody try and join us or something? I don't see a request. The sons that lead the great heathen army are a guy named Halfdan and another son named Ivar the Boneless. That's his nickname. We don't know where he gets the name Boneless, but you can probably come up with all kinds of interesting theories on that. There was a third son named Ubi, who will make an appearance. He might have been there at this time, but he's definitely going to make an appearance a little bit later. And so the Anglo-Saxons are intent on attacking Northumbria because that's where Aella is. That's where the guy who killed Ragnar Lothbrok is. But they land in East Anglia and they make pretty generous peace terms with the East Anglians. We'll let you keep your kingdom. We won't rape and pillage here, but you have to give us horses for our army. And the East Anglians are completely outmanned. So they give in and they give horses to the great heathen army. And what's going on in Northumbria at this time is that Aella, who wasn't a king at the time that he killed Ragnar Lothbrok, is now vying to be king. And there's a dynastic struggle between Aella and a guy named Osbert. So we've got two guys fighting over the throne for the kingdom of Northumbria. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle kind of dismisses Aella as an upstart. He's what they call a king with no hereditary right. So even if Aella has power there, definitely not solid backing in the kingdom. And it's possible the Vikings know about this. They realize that Northumbria is weakened from within. So they have landed in East Anglia, which borders Northumbria to the south, and they stage a two-pronged assault on Northumbria. They divide their army in half. Part of it goes on land, riding the horses that they've gotten from the East Anglians, and then the rest goes by sea in the fleet that they've attacked with. So they're attacking from two different directions, two different modes of attack. And they capture the city of York, which is right on the Humber River. So now they've got a base of operations in Northumbria. They've got the most important city in the kingdom. Osbert and Aella, the two guys that are fighting with each other, decide that they're going to join forces against the common enemy, against the heathens. And on Palm Sunday, good Christian holiday, right? Where surely if God's going to be with us, he's going to be with us on Palm Sunday. They attack the city of York. Now, York is a Roman city, so it has walls around it, but it's been several hundred years since the Romans have been there, and the walls are sort of in disrepair. So the Vikings are not completely invulnerable inside of York. But Osbert and Aella attack, and their attack fails. The Vikings defeat this attack on them, and they take Aella captive. And they mete out to him a vengeance that, according to legend, is called the Blood Eagle. So they stake Aella to the ground. They cut open his chest while he's still living, and they pull out his lungs so that it looks like a couple of eagle's wings coming out of his chest while he's still alive. Okay. This is called the Blood Eagle, and this is how they kill Aella. What a painful, awful death to suffer. But they've sent the message, right? This is the vengeance for killing Ragnar Lothbrok. The Northumbrians, quote, make peace in the terms of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, basically surrender, okay? And the Vikings install a friendly puppet king to keep an eye on Northumbria while they continue their planned conquest of the island of Britain. So the next place that they attack is the kingdom of Mercia. And they capture the city of Nottingham, which is in Mercia. And the Mercians shrewdly say, we need help. We're going to make an alliance with our ancient enemies in Wessex because we all got to band together and fight these Vikings. And the way that they make this alliance is through a royal marriage. A princess in Mercia will marry a prince in Wessex. And the prince that they marry is a guy named Alfred. And at this point, I'm going to pause and I'm going to ask, who in this room has heard of Alfred the Great? Okay, we got 2 out of 1, 2, 3, out of 7. Okay, not very good odds. How about in Zoom land? How many people have heard of Alfred the Great? Clark looks like he's saying no. Kim, you've probably heard of him. Okay, we got thumbs up from the Borkhards. Good. All right, Alfred the Great is the only English king called the Great. And as we're going to see, probably tonight, if not tonight, certainly next week, he deserves it. Alfred is one of these amazing figures in history. And it's shocking that really very few people know about him because of the role that he plays in saving Britain for Christianity and essentially creating England. All right, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So Alfred at this point is not a king. He's a brother of the West Saxon king, and he is used in this alliance between Mercia and Wessex, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about Alfred because he is such an important figure in our story, okay? Number one, the fact that he's going to become king is extremely improbable. He's the youngest of several boys, okay? He's the baby of the family, essentially. So all of his older brothers would have to die in order for him to become king. And that's what's going to happen, okay? And again, he was kind of the baby of the family, kind of spoiled. When his father took a pilgrimage to Rome, he took little Alfred with him, the only one of the sons that went with. Even as a little kid, though, he demonstrates precocious intelligence. His father puts a challenge to the boys to come up with the best poem of the group. And it's little Alfred who comes up with the best poem, better than all of his brothers who are several years older than him. And he learns to read and write from a very young age. And in fact, he keeps what he calls his handbook. We would call it maybe a journal, okay? But he has this little book that he keeps with him. And when he learns something interesting, he writes it down. Now, this is really, really weird in Anglo-Saxon England. People of his class, by and large, do not know how to read and write. And they certainly don't carry books around with them and write things down in it. Okay? You might read the Bible on Sunday if you're really that inclined, but having a little journal that you carry around, very strange. He's also super pious. When he becomes a young teenager, right, and he starts to have sexual urges, he knows that these are sinful, and he prays to God, please, God, deliver me from these terrible sexual urges that I'm having. And God answers his prayers by giving him hemorrhoids. So he can't focus on his sexual urges anymore because of the hemorrhoids. And this is an age where when you went somewhere, you rode on horseback. Okay? So hemorrhoids are a real problem for people in this. And there's no preparation H, okay? So they called it in Latin, they called them the figs, which is an interesting description of it. And then to top everything off, he's the guy that is going to marry this Mercian princess and seal the alliance between Mercia and Wessex so they can unite against the Vikings, this great heathen army. And on his wedding day, he suddenly collapses. And he's like curled up in a little ball. He's holding his stomach. And it's the first fit that he's going to have in an affliction that bothers him for the rest of his life. And historians have tried to figure out what is Alfred's medical condition. One theory is that it's Crohn's disease. Okay, he's got some kind of a digestive tract issue where certain foods will set him off and he'll be basically suddenly incapacitated. Okay, not a characteristic you want in a king when you're dealing with the Viking threat. Okay, but that's what he's got. So he's there at Nottingham celebrating his wedding, has this fit of Crohn's disease, and the Mercians and the West Saxons attack the city of Nottingham or lay siege to it, which the Vikings have held. And the Vikings are basically like, we're outnumbered, but we don't need to come out and fight because we've got the walls of Nottingham around us. So the Anglo-Saxons lay siege for a while, but they are not equipped for siege warfare. And basically they end up melting away and the Vikings continue to hold Nottingham. So not an auspicious beginning for Alfred's military career. So the Vikings realize that the Mercians and West Saxons have allied with each other. It's going to be easier to pick off East Anglia, the odd man out. They don't have an alliance with anybody. So they invade East Anglia, which is ruled by a guy named King Edmund. And they offer to King Edmund to divide his kingdom with him. We'll take half, we'll leave you half and let you be king and your half, and we'll take our chunk. And according to later legend, King Edmund refuses on the basis that they are heathens. And he would not see any part of his Christian kingdom given over to pagans, to non-believers. And so the Vikings say, okay, fair enough. They capture King Edmund and they kill him by tying him to a tree and then one by one shooting arrows into him. Okay? And according to legend, after he's died this agonizing, slow, painful death, or hasn't quite died, but he's standing there looking like a hedgehog, okay, bristling with spines, they go and they cut off his head. And they take his head out into the woods, and a Christian legend builds up around Saint Edmund that the following morning, after the Vikings have left, his followers go out looking for the head and they hear the head calling to them. And they go and they find it in the paws of a wolf. A wolf has been protecting King Edmund's head. So they take some meat that they've got and they throw it off to the side to distract this wolf. And he goes over and he ravenously eats this meat, which tells him this wolf who's been starving to death wouldn't touch King Edmund's head. So they take the head back, they rejoin it with the body, they bury him, and miracles start to occur around King Edmund, soon to be called Saint Edmund. Okay? And I want you to keep Saint Edmund in mind because he's going to come back later and get his vengeance against the Vikings, but that's a story for a little bit later on. So now the Vikings are ready to invade Wessex. They've tried Mercia, They've taken East Anglia, they've taken Northumbria. Let's try our luck in Wessex. And their first invasion happens in the years 870, 871. So 4 years they've been marauding in the rest of Britain. And it's at this time in April of 871 that Alfred's last surviving brother dies. And the Anglo-Saxons are basically at the point where who else do we have to make king other than this kid with hemorrhoids who sometimes falls down unexpectedly and curls up into a ball, the kid who has the little book that he carries. This is who we've got to turn to be our king. Okay? The West Saxons are not super enthused about King Alfred, but they don't have any other choices. They are at the end of the bullpen here. And because of this sudden change in the throne, the West Saxons have to buy peace. They have to pay the Vikings to go away. And fortunately for the West Saxons, shortly after this happens, the Northumbrians revolt. And now the Vikings have to go and deal with that rebellion in Northumbria. It buys Wessex a little bit of time to get things organized. And when they go back on the offensive, they decide the time is ripe to invade Mercia. They launch a surprise attack on Mercia, so successful that the king of Mercia, a guy named Burgred, actually abdicates and flees Britain altogether. He takes a religious pilgrimage and goes to Rome, and the Vikings install a puppet king in Mercia. And now we've got Wessex as the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom standing, and it's ruled by this kid named Alfred. Has anybody watched the Netflix show called The Last Kingdom? If you're interested in this history, that's what this series is about. It's about this particular series of events that I've been talking about so far, and what I'm going to be talking about, the fall of the British kingdoms, and the name comes from the fact that Wessex is the last English kingdom. All right, so now Alfred has been on the throne for a few years, and we've seen that Alfred is pretty bookish, okay? He's a thinker. And so when the Vikings decide that they're going to attack Wessex, they start by probing the southern coast of Wessex. And Alfred, even though there's no navy to speak of, Alfred finds some guys to build ships and decides to fight the Vikings where they're strongest. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that that summer, King Alfred went out to sea with a naval force and fought against the crews of 7 ships and captured 1 ship and put the rest to flight. Think about this. The Vikings beaten on the sea by the Anglo-Saxons. Alfred puts everybody on alert that he is going to think outside the box, and he is going to figure out a way to beat these Vikings, but it isn't going to be easy. In 875, the Viking army divides in half. Halfdan, remember, he was the leader, or one of the 2 leaders of the great heathen army, decides he's ready to retire. He's going to take his men and get what they've earned. We're going to become farmers up in Northumbria. We don't know whatever happened to Ivor the Boneless, the other son, the other leader of the great heathen army. One legend is that he died in Ireland, but there's no firm facts fixing the fate of Ivor the Boneless. So we've got this other half of the Viking army left behind, and it's going to be governed or ruled, led by a guy named Guthrum. So our main adversary for Alfred going forward is this guy named Guthrum. And in 876, he invades Wessex and rides overland through Wessex to the southern coast and seizes a coastal town named Wareham. And so Alfred calls together the Fyrd, the Anglo-Saxon army, and leads it to Wareham. And he has studied the failure at Nottingham, studied what led to the failure of that siege. And so now he's organized and ready to lead a prolonged siege, which he does, and finally forces the Viking army that's bottled up in this town of Wareham they promise to leave. And in fact, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that they swore, quote, on their holy ring. And we don't know exactly what that means, but it's portrayed as like this unprecedented thing, okay? That Alfred forces them to swear on their holy ring. They've never done this before, apparently. So they exchange hostages with the West Saxons. And then when Alfred withdraws, trusting them to leave, Guthrum reneges. And he sneaks out of Wareham. He rides overland to Exeter, which is further along the southern coast, kills his West Saxon hostages, and at the same time, his fleet set sail to meet him at Exeter. But along the way, the Viking fleet is wrecked by a storm, and the survivors wash up on shore. The Anglo-Saxons fall on them, and they behead all of them, okay? And of course, this is viewed by the English as God's divine punishment of the Vikings for their duplicity. And now Guthrum is trapped inside of Exeter. Alfred offers some humiliating terms to the Vikings, but allows them to live. And as we're going to see, Alfred has it in his mind, remember, he's a very pious guy. Alfred has it in his mind that he's going to be able to convert the Vikings to Christianity. But not yet. Guthrum retreats to Mercia to lick his wounds. And that's where we're going to leave the story for tonight. We're going to pick up next week with Alfred temporarily triumphant over the Vikings and the Vikings licking their wounds in Mercia. But I assure you that the story is not over yet. The Vikings are not done. And they're going to surprise Alfred next week. So, any questions about what I covered tonight before I turn you loose?
Thanks for the movie tip, though.
Yeah, it's a good show. It's actually pretty historically accurate in its way.
There's also the story of the Vikings, the series, The Vikings, which sort of, it's about Ragnar Lothbrok and his family and all that, and tries to give a storyline to what it was, a lot of myths and incomplete history, because nothing was really written down in terms of Viking lore.
Yeah, I've only seen one or two episodes of that. I probably should watch it, but
It's interesting how that goes, and what's interesting is the clash of Norse mythology, Norse rhythm, Odin and all that, with Christianity. and how the clash of the two happened. And what's interesting too is that the Vikings also went east. And the Vikings were some of the first to go into Russia. And they were Christianized there by the Orthodox Church. That's how the Russian Orthodox. So eventually they became Christians at that group of Vikings. But it's an interesting how they portray it, whether it's totally true. But a lot of it's based on legend and stories because they didn't write a lot of stuff down.
They wrote a lot of stuff down later
Later.
in the sagas, lots
Right,
of
the
stories
sagas.
about the Vikings. All right, well, thank you so much for attending tonight, and I assure you that next week is one you don't want to miss. There's a great story when Alfred deals with the Vikings for the second round.
Thanks, Mike.
Have a great week.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Fantastic.
I hope I don't have any bad dreams tonight.